Everybody who values human life, dignity, and justice is infuriated by the images and the pure cowardice of what Hamas has done. Hamas essentially keeps 2 to 3 million Palestinians hostage. We want to ask ourselves, are we acting in our strategic interest by just going kind of down the bloodlust, decades-long war that drains the empire's coffers? I think the government in Israel will eventually fall because of that error. But the danger strategically at the moment is an overreaction that can destabilize Israel's long-term interests. At some point, however, a population has to be accountable for those that live within it. One of the only solutions that I could come up with people have been asking me to provide my insights on the current chaos in Palestine and the Israelis in the Gaza Strip. And, by way of disclaimer, obviously, I don't have a master's in this area, but I do have considerable training on strategy and risk. And this event is soul crushing in terms of seeing another terrorist attack on innocent people. Having served in the military, I understand what it takes to kit up, take an assault weapon, and fight other soldiers. But the amount of cowardice that exists in people who attack unarmed civilians with assault weapons makes me sick to my stomach. And if I was still serving, I'd probably suit up and go and join some of my Israeli brothers and sisters attacking some Hamas terrorists. But by way of context, I think people aren't really understanding how difficult this situation is. And I'm going to talk about a few things here: false equivalencies, the fact that two things can exist at once, and the moral courage needed to act with a long-term strategy as opposed to short-term retribution or short-term acts that soothe the bloodlust of the population, but might undermine your ultimate strategic objectives. Case in point is 9/11, one of the most horrific attacks ever on innocent civilians. The United States government in launching a campaign in Afghanistan to destabilize the Taliban and try to capture Osama. That was not a bad operation, except they didn't get Osama, and they should have. 20 years of war in Afghanistan, as well as an Iraq invasion, was the destruction of trillions of dollars of capital that made the empire weaker. So we always want to make sure that when we have something that happens to us that's unbelievably catastrophic, we want to ask ourselves, are we acting in our strategic interest by just going kind of down the bloodlust route and engaging in a decades-long war that drains the empire's coffers? I think there's some similarities here in the Gaza and what just happened with Hamas and their terrorist attack. Everybody who values human life, dignity, and justice is infuriated by the images of killing unarmed men, women, and children, taking hostages, and the pure cowardice of what Hamas has done. Hamas essentially keeps 2 to 3 million Palestinians hostage in the Gaza. I've been there. It is the most densely populated city in the world, and it's got between 2 to 3 million people. By way of comparison, some of you may have heard of the Grozny campaign where Russia got into a war in Chechnya, and there was a city called Grozny. It had a population of 240,000 people, nowhere near as densely populated. It was one of the hardest battles the Soviet Union ever fought. And it's because when you fight in a built-up area, in a city, it is the most dangerous place to fight for any soldier. Every corner has a booby trap. Every door has somebody potentially behind it. There's cement everywhere. There's no line of sights for long-range shooting. If you go and fight in a built-up area, you're going to take mass casualties as a military. When you look at what Russia did, which was essentially shell the whole city for a few months and then go in house to house, they killed 10% of the civilian population in that operation, and it took a long time. So those calling for kind of leveling, Lindsey Graham, I think, called to level Gaza, right? The majority, there's a much higher percentage of children and women in Gaza because of the nature of that population. A lot of the men have been killed. But when you look at the most densely populated city in the world, that's bordered by the ocean on one side, Egypt that has a very tight border on the other, and the Israeli forces on the other, how do you do that, right? How many people are you prepared to kill to punish terrorists? And I think at some point Israel also has to look at what happened with this massive intelligence failure. Like, how could the most sophisticated intelligence mechanisms in the world fail to know about this attack at this scale, right? They flew out of Gaza, they went boats on Gaza, they went in vehicles in Gaza. I think the government in Israel will eventually fall because of that error. But the danger strategically at the moment is an overreaction that can destabilize Israel's long term interests and the West's long term interests, and possibly could result in World War III. An overreaction in that isolated, densely populated area of Gaza could turn the tides in the Middle East against the West, could result in political uprisings. We don't know what's going to happen. So, what I ask people to think about is what strategically makes the most sense. Before I get to that, though, I want to talk about the concept of false equivalency, because what I've seen is the people who rush to comment on this incident right away are generally the people who are the most emotionally tied to wanting to feel right about injustices they carry. And so I saw in the first few days tons of emotional and often not really well thought out responses and suggestions to how to deal with this. And we always have to, as humans, govern our desire to crush something or somebody who does a big injustice to us. That doesn't always make sense. Like, even as an individual, somebody can do an injustice to us and we can react in a way that puts us in jail for life. Maybe not the right solution, even though we might be justified. But what annoys me is kind of this false equivalency that what Hamas did is equal to what the Israeli government is doing. And it's not true from my perspective, and respectful to people who might disagree with me. But Hamas is a terrorist organization that went out and shot and killed and murdered unarmed men, women, and children. Israeli Defense Force doesn't generally do that. You might not agree with all of their policies in terms of settlements and how they're dealing with the Palestinians, but they're being forced to deal with them in the Gaza because the rest of the Arab world wants nothing to do with the Palestinians either. And they love having that problem there because it destabilizes Israel. And so all of the other Arab and Persian states around Israel love having a Palestinian problem in Israel. It allows them to foment dissent, disrupt Israeli success. And when you have an organization like Hamas that has publicly said that they're dedicated to the complete destruction of Israel, how do you negotiate with somebody like that? You can't. But then the problem from a strategic perspective is, how do you defeat an enemy like that that's buried inside of a densely populated city of 3 million? In the old days, and they're so fortunate that Israel is a westernized democracy, because I can tell you what every empire in the past would do is kill everybody in there, right? And they would just remove the problem. Many of the empires that surround Israel would do the exact same thing to their own populations if they had a similar issue. So what do we do in the modern day? There's a thirst for blood, understandably, within the Israeli population. There's a very vocal and powerful minority group that's very religious in Israel that has their voting bloc often is the difference in the balance of power in elections. And so this very religious group has a disproportionate influence on Israel. And anybody who believes fundamentally in their own religious views, I often believe, are not acting in the greater interest of all people in the region. So that's a problem Israel has to deal with. How do you deal with Gaza when they've just launched this incredibly horrific terrorist attack on their civilians that's on par with 9/11? I don't know why some Americans are saying level the place, because strategically, I don't know what that does to the world. And I don't know what it does to the conscience of Israelis, because they're good people, right? And there are war crimes. The Geneva Conventions does have war crimes. You're not allowed to deliberately target civilian areas where there's a disproportionate casualty rate of civilians. And we have to acknowledge that most of the people in Gaza are civilians who have nowhere to go, who are poor, and have no options. And so what does that do to your culture if you kill 500,000 innocent women and children because you're upset at this? These are tough questions, but leaders have to have good solutions to tough questions, not just do what, the population calls for right away. So that thoughtful reflection, I think, is needed in this particular case. We need to get rid of Hamas, and every country should condemn them, regardless of your religion. And I don't like seeing some people out there trying to make excuses for what happened in some of these protests. What would be better for peace is if there were mass protests by all cultures saying we need peace in the region and condemning terrorist attacks. Instead, we seem to kind of be moving camps. And finally, one thing I would share, maybe from a strategic perspective, and you tell me if it could work or not, because I am really reluctant to see how many people would die if they just tried to take over Gaza in house-to-house fighting. The cost will be tremendous. The ability of massacres to go wrong and affect public policy and strategic global policy. If you bomb the wrong hospital by mistake and kill 200 children, the geopolitical impacts are huge. I was talking to some of my Israeli friends who had been in that desert location where that rave was, and had actually lived in the kibbutz for a while that was attacked. And it was really viscerally real for him to recount what happened, knowing that he had been there, and to imagine, terrorists just running there and shooting people, taking hostages. At some point, however, a population has to be accountable for those that live within it. One of the only solutions that I could come up with is I would have stepped back after that happened, secured the perimeter of Gaza so no future attacks could happen. That would protect my innocent population. After thinking about it, I would say to the people of Gaza, you have 1 week to turn over Hamas. They're living within your population. At some point, you have to cast out that which enslaves you. And although I understand you might want to blame Israel, when you have a terrorist organization living within your walls and that are doing terrorist acts to innocent people, you as a population have to say, hey, look, that is not acceptable. You might not agree with what Israeli policies are, but if you could get rid of Hamas, there's a greater likelihood you could integrate into society a bit more. But as long as they're operating there, so what I would have done is said, I'm going to give you 7 days, the people of Gaza. And I'd say, if you give us Hamas in a way that's meaningful, we can turn supplies back on. There's a chance for you to live. But if you don't, because you won't give them to us and we can't deal with them hidden in your cities, we have to come in because we're not going to tolerate these types of attacks on our population. So you've got 7 days, turn them over and ask the 2 to 3 million people to turn on the asshole terrorists that are living in their ranks. You need to do that to have your own population survive. And if you're not willing to do that, even die turning over Hamas so that your children can live or have some sort of future, unfortunately, I think the ramifications of this terrorist attack are going to be far reaching and almost or possibly as impactful as 9/11. That's all I can come up with from a strategy. It's either mass casualties or the population turns over Hamas, and it might be easier said than done. But when your life is on the line and your future is on the line, turn in the terrorists and try to work for peace in a region that deserves some stability.